In my young years at home, my dad seldom talked about his ordeal. If someone asked him, he would answer their questions, but it wasn't a subject he cared to dwell on. So there were many details of that night that I was never aware of. But with the finding of the sunken ship and the lifting of the artifacts, a new generation became aware of the tragedy. I was contacted at that time regarding the recovery of a set of bagpipes believed to be my father's. Movies, books, television shows roused a new interest in the Titanic. One book in particular gave me the rest of Dad's story. It's a book titled The Irish Aboard the Titanic by author Senan Maloney, published by Wolfhound Press, Dublin, Ireland. And it depicts the personal stories and pictures of each individual Irish passenger on board the Titanic, providing all the details that I can now share with you. Senan Maloney's book tells of Eugene playing his pipes for the few dances and parties on the steerage deck on those last nights that they enjoyed before the sinking. He probably went to his cabin pleasantly tired after playing all the jigs and reels that they so loved to dance to. He was a pretty fair step dancer himself, but he didn't get much rest that night. Not too long after he had said his prayers and put his head on the pillow, he was awakened by a heavy jolt. He sat up, wide awake, and had a sharp intuition that something was very wrong. His first thought was for his cousin and her friend, because they were put in his care. He got up quickly, pulled down his trousers, got his shoes on, grabbed the life jacket hanging from the wall of the cabin and put it on, and then he hoisted himself into his heavy, old black overcoat with its astrakhan collar. He grabbed his watch and his rosary beads and put them in his pocket. Outside in the corridor, people were scurrying around in confusion, and the staff kept telling them to calm down, that everything was going to be fine. But Eugene wasn't buying any of that. He made his way, and a long way it was, to the other side of the steerage deck where the women and children's cabins were located. The steerage accommodation had the men on one extreme end of the deck and the women and children on the other. He found the girls' cabin and banged on their door to awaken them. They were tired and cranky, and they told him to go back to bed. But he persisted and finally was able to persuade them to put on warm clothing, their life jackets, and to gather their valuables and come with him. They had a terrible struggle to get up to the deck where the lifeboats were being lowered, but they succeeded in spite of many efforts to stop them. In the girls' accounts of their ordeal, they both wrote home that only for Eugene's efforts and care over them they would have been lost. Lifeboats were being filled and lowered from the davits on the side of the ship. It was terrifying and perilous, being lowered from that height above the water. Women and children only was the cry of the hour. When they got there, Eugene and the girls knelt and prayed together on the deck. Then Eugene ushered them into the lifeboat and tried to board it along with them, thinking that he might be able to help as an oarsman. But the ship's officer in charge of overseeing the boats held him back at gunpoint. My dad retreated, afraid of being shot, but other men rushed forward. The ship's officer shot down two of them right before my father's eyes. There was utter confusion. Then my dad heard another shot ring out. He couldn't see what was happening, but he was told by the people around him that the officer who had shot the two men a few minutes before had put the gun to his own head and shot himself. I'm sure he did it in despair for what he had to do. My dad later saw his body on the deck. It was a terrible night. After leaving the girls and being put back from the lifeboat, my dad wandered around the deck full of frantic people. He spotted a few men trying to free a collapsible lifeboat that was hanging on the wall of a steward's office on the deck. Eugene joined them as they desperately tried to cut it down. But as they were working on the ropes, the ship gave a downward lurch and they found themselves up to their hips in the water. Here I refer to the official account of Eugene's ordeal as told to the doctor on the rescue ship, the Carpathia. In the doctor's words, here was this poor man. He fell back on the pillow, crying and sobbing. My God, if only I could forget those women's cries. Eugene went on to tell the doctor about trying to free the lifeboat. In Eugene's own words, as we worked on the ropes, the ship gave a lurch downwards and we were up to our hips in the water. Then she rose again slightly and we were able to cut the second rope, which held her stern. Then another great lurch threw the boat and myself and the others off and away from the ship into the water. I fell on one of the oars and into a mass of people. Everything I touched seemed to be women's hair. Children were crying, women screaming with their hair in their faces. My God, if I could only forget those faces and hands that I touched. Eugene went on to describe the horror of seeing people on the surface of the water, sucked down into those four enormous funnels of the ship as it finally disappeared from view. My dad managed to swim to the collapsible which they had freed. It had landed in the water upside down. When he got there, there were already people clinging to it. He found a place to hang on to with the others. There were about 15 in all, including a ship's officer. Some died and let go before they were found by a stray lifeboat that had mercifully turned back, scouring the now silent waters for anyone still alive. Miraculously, after hanging on for hours, my dad and the others were pulled into that boat. He said he thought his heavy old coat had protected him a lot as he hung in the water, but I think he had a much greater protector than that, wouldn't you say? My dad said he suffered intensely in that boat before the big ship came at dawn. I remember that coat. My dad wore it for years afterwards, and it was still in the house when I left home to come to America. It had a greenish tinge by then, possibly from the sea water, and we used to call it the Titanic. The impact of this tragedy and its subsequent hearings brought about many stern rulings to ensure that such blatant disregard for passenger safety could never occur again. Blame fell heavily on the man responsible for the insufficient number of lifeboats, the designer of the ship. He was so confident of his own skill, he swore that the ship was unsinkable. Then there were hundreds of messages being sent by wealthy passengers over the ship's radio. This was the first time that this service was available to passengers, and the airwaves were swamped with these messages. And the radio operators had such a time trying to get them through that they weren't paying as much attention as they should to the warnings of ice fields ahead. Captain Smith, even after being made aware of these warnings, never gave an order to slow down the speed of the ship. There was a hidden agenda there. It was the captain's hope to beat the speed record of the Titanic's sister ships on this voyage. It was a great gamble. They never thought of it as gambling with the lives of those on board. They gambled and they lost. The heading of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, dated April 16, 1912, reads as follows: 1,302 lives lost when the Titanic sank, 868 saved. Today, as we remember these victims of that horrible tragedy that shocked the world of that time, may our hearts and minds reflect on the value of life, all life, as we plunge forward through the turmoil of this world that we find ourselves in today. May we look beyond ourselves to the only hope we have, the voice that bids us love one another as I have loved you. May God save America. May God save our world. Amen. Thank you.